Welcome to LeaderCast, episode 290. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers. Tim, are people leaving the church?
Sarah, people have been leaving the church for decades, for centuries, for millennia.
Okay, so we're going to end this episode very quickly. Today, we want to explore the question, are people leaving the church? And why creating disciple-making relationships is essential to addressing the challenge that we're facing. Here's the reality that we like to forget. In the United Methodist Church, we've been in a steady, but not heavy, decline for over 50 years. The church in decline means, yes, people are leaving. You could find similar statistics for Christianity in general across the United States. We're not dealing with anything new, and we're not dealing with a massive decline. It's been a slow fade. As we've explored in episodes 285 through 287, missional leadership is needed in this time. We're living in a missionary age. There's been a shift.
Yeah, like it or not, there's been a shift. The church is in decline in terms of numbers. So not just the United Methodist Church, that includes every offshoot branch and cousin along with the Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. The church is in decline.
And one of the statistics that has long been used and is a horrible measure of engagement in church is worship attendance.
So why don't you tell us how you really feel about that statistic, Sarah?
Okay, so I won't say more than this. Counting people doesn't tell us anything about missional impact. Counting doesn't demonstrate growth in faith, discipleship, or transformation. However, it's one of the only consistent numbers that we have. So we look at it as an indicator, nothing more.
Yeah, the recent church attendance levels are about 10% lower than what Gallup measured in 2012 and most years before that.
So we've been declining about 1% every year, and that's been consistent for as long as I can remember. In a much smaller number of churches, about 300 churches from the Unstuck Church Report noted a 22%, are you ready for this one? Increase in in-person attendance over the last 12 months, while online attendance has decreased by 6%. They went on to report that while people have come back to worship and largely recovered to pre-COVID numbers, they're not connecting with small groups or serving on teams. So engagement is lagging.
So that proves your point about church attendance.
Yes, that wasn't my intent, but yes, it does. So what do those trends say to you, Tim?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, Sarah, what it says to me is that, and I don't like using this word because people receive it in different ways, but the church has become irrelevant and disconnected.
That's saying it plainly.
So being irrelevant doesn't mean that it doesn't have something to say to the culture. It just means that the way we've interacted with the culture is shifting. And so how the culture is moving and the church is lagging behind in that movement. Being disconnected is another shift because, have all been born and grown up in a time when the church and the culture were almost the same. And there's such a shift in that now that the church has become disconnected from the very communities in which they're located. And we can come up with lots of reasons for that. One of them may be that people who began the church there moved away, their children have moved away, but yet there are people that come back to the church, back to the building. The church never moves. People may move, but the community of faith is still there. And so the way we think about church has become irrelevant, and the way we live church has become disconnected with the community. Does that Make sense?
It sure does. So let me rewind just a second here and offer something additional about the Unstuck group study. The churches that were included in that study have an average attendance of 623. So vastly larger than most United Methodist churches. In a recent article by the Lewis Center, they noted that the median worship attendance in the United Methodist Church is 38. Median being the number in the middle, that there's 50% above that and 50% below that. And if you're asking, was that before churches left with disaffiliation or after? The number didn't change with disaffiliation.
So there's the desire to find a reason for what's happening in declining attendance. The reality is there is no one reason. So let's dispel another reason for decline.
COVID.
COVID's been a catch-all. It's been blamed for many things in the past 3 years, and some rightly so, and others because it felt like a scapegoat was needed. The reality is it isn't clear if the continued decline is because of COVID or simply a continuation of trends, which COVID might have encouraged a little bit.
Right. All we really know is when most churches were only gathering online, many got out of the habit of weekly attendance in worship, or they thought it was quote unquote on demand and they could watch it at any time.
So let's talk about that just for a minute. Did going online during COVID reveal something or invite a change in behavior?
To me, it feels like the chicken and the egg conversation. However, I think when we went online, it pointed to the perception that attending church was a passive experience. There were a few that I know that did really well with getting people engaged online. They asked questions, they invited people to comment in chat, they were meeting on Zoom where people could engage in conversation about what they were hearing in the message. But by and large, it was a passive experience. Hit play and watch.
Okay, you haven't said it, but I will. With what you've just said, if you look at it, when we were in person before the pandemic, it was come, set for a live performance. That's the passive way.
A nice talk and good music for a small donation. Sorry, that sounds horrible because you and I both know that's not what worship is about at all.
So, Sarah, what's coming to mind is how Wesley had classes, class meetings, bands to keep people in relationship and accountable. And what I'm really thinking is that it was the class meetings and the bands where the transformation took place. Even when people gathered for worship, it was secondary. It was the class meetings and bands that made the difference.
Yeah. And I think if I'm remembering my Methodist history appropriately, it was those classes and bands where the movement really happened and ignited the movement in Methodism that the Wesley brothers were leading. Okay, we could go down that rabbit trail, but I think you've got another reality.
Yeah, as we continue to think about decline and how we address it, we've talked about a couple of realities that don't have clear reasons. I'll raise a question that I talk about a lot, and that is, does politics have anything to do with it?
So I'm going to need you to say more. Do you mean the church expressing a position on a social or political issue that you, I'm going to say it this way, disagree with, and so you disengage? Or do you mean our folks that are claiming to be quote unquote independent Democrats or Republicans participating more in church or disengaging more?
Yes. Either one.
Okay, so there's no difference in a person's political views and participation in religious service. So independents, Democrats, and Republicans participate equally. But
yeah, but what is it?
Well, I only have anecdotal evidence that anytime you express opinions and perspectives that might be called charged topics, someone's going to get mad. You're going to irritate someone. And often they threaten to take their toys and they leave the church.
So, like kindergarten?
Yes, that's exactly what it feels like. Now hear me. When I look to Jesus, Jesus didn't say popular things either. He frustrated people and turned common thinking upside down and inside out. One difference might be the rate at which those stingers, if I can call them that, traveled was only as fast as people could talk to one another. There wasn't email and there wasn't social media. Now, my point in even asking what you meant by politics is that this is once again opinion. Anytime you ask people to choose sides, whether it's choosing sides between staff members, between a pastor and a church leader, around perspectives, you are creating scenarios where there are winners and there are losers. In the church, we're on Team Jesus. Period. Hard stop. There's only one team. When you set up sides, you're no longer on Team Jesus.
You've said that clearly, and where I usually go with that, and this is part of what we're dealing with in the church today, is it matters where you start. And if you start with Jesus, there's always opportunity for transformation. But if you've got to start with your opinion, with your perspective, your political stance, you're going to try to convince people to come, as you've already said, to your side. And Jesus becomes secondary in those conversations. So that's what my mind goes to. So as we've said many times, Scripture is not a recipe, a task list, or a to-do list. You don't have to have a secret decoder ring on what Jesus would say or do. But when you look at who Jesus is and what Jesus did, we can say Jesus consistently spoke up, acted on behalf of, and included those who were outsiders. I want to say that again. He stood with people that the church today has difficulty standing with.
So can we shift to the really uncomfortable reality for the church? The church does not have pride of place in society any longer.
Well, that's stating it clearly.
Do you think differently?
No. I mean, when I started in ministry 50 years ago, in one of the communities that I lived in, there was always, in the newspaper, there was always a response to the preacher's sermon. It was in the newspaper. You read anything about preachers today in the newspaper, and it's how badly we've acted. I remember being, even as a 20-year-old, early 20s, and being included in community events because the church needed to be represented in what was being decided. Didn't make any difference whether I had any experience or not. I was the pastor of the church. So the culture has changed. And, we've talked a lot about Christendom and now the missionary age that we're in. When the church and the culture were one and the same, the church had a different respect. Whether it was right or not might be the question. But as the culture's changed, we're in a different place.
So here's a simple, but it might sound silly to some people because it's the daily experience for them. It's uncomfortable not to be in the majority. It takes extra effort to connect with people, to share God's love, and if we're really honest, we want things to go back to the way that they were. It's hard, but it's not impossible. So when you look at where the Spirit has taken root and lit a fire that changes hearts and minds, it's been in places where the church was either forced underground or it was in the minority. So we can either accept the reality that we don't have pride of place and learn a new way forward, or we can sit in a puddle of self-pity and continue to decline. Those are the choices that I see.
So, Sarah, before we move to the next piece, it's just that what comes to mind. And if we really did a study of the scripture, we allow it to interpret us and not us trying to add our ideas to it. But this is one I've always liked. It's in Acts 8. I think it's chapter 1. The church is under persecution. And I think it says, all but the apostles scattered across the countryside. The church was at its greatest strength when it was under persecution, when it was the minority, when it was making a difference. It became, as Jesus might have said in one of his little things about helping people understand, it was the leaven in the bread. It began to be the presence where it hadn't been before. So really what we're talking about then is accepting current reality and the implications of that. So that's where we are now, isn't it?
It sure is. And let's do that on the next episode. We're going to leave you with a cliffhanger for a couple of reasons to consider. How are you still leading in ways that assume that the church has pride of place? And how might you need to shift your role as a leader and your approach as a leader to guiding people to engage in building relationships and connecting with your community? So that's where we'll head in the next episode. But Tim, is there anything that you would like to say to wrap up this episode?
I don't know that there's anything I can add. What has come to mind, and you've given me an opportunity to say again, is that what would it really be like if we start, even though behind every number there's a person, but we stopped counting people and began to employ people in loving the community? That the real impact isn't the number of people that we have in worship, but it's the transformation that's taking place in the community.
Yes. So thank you for joining us for episode 290. We'll continue this conversation in episode 291, and you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/290. And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.